They thought she was just another black woman to push around, but when these cops slapped on the cuffs, they had no idea she was a U.S. Army general. One phone call to the Pentagon, and their careers were over before the day was done. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. General Vanessa Carter, a decorated U.S. Army officer with over 25 years of honorable service, was driving home from visiting her elderly mother. She wasn't in uniform that day, just wearing jeans, a comfortable hoodie, and her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. If you passed her on the street, you'd never guess she was one of the highest-ranking women in the military, a leader who had spent decades serving her country and protecting others. The roads were calm, the air crisp, and Vanessa was lost in thought about the upcoming week's meetings at the Pentagon. But her peaceful drive took a sudden turn as she stopped at a red light on a suburban street. A police cruiser pulled up behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. She had always respected law enforcement, and as a soldier, she believed in rules, order, and justice. Then, in her rearview mirror, she saw it, the burst of flashing red and blue lights. Vanessa frowned, signaling, and slowly pulled over to the curb. She figured maybe there was a traffic checkpoint, or perhaps she had a brake light out. Routine stuff. But the moment the two officers stepped out of their cruiser and approached, the air shifted. Their strides were sharp, almost aggressive, and their faces were tight with suspicion. One officer, tall and broad-shouldered, barked, "Step out of the vehicle." Now, the command was abrupt, carrying no warmth, no explanation. Vanessa, trained to keep calm under pressure, kept her voice steady. "Officer," she said politely, "may I know why I'm being stopped?" The second officer, a younger man with mirrored sunglasses, replied curtly, "Suspicious vehicle in the area. Matches your description." Her brow furrowed. Suspicious vehicle? What exactly does that mean? She didn't get an answer. Instead, before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt, the tall officer reached in, yanked open her door, and motioned for her to get out. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. Vanessa hesitated, her mind racing. This wasn't how standard stops worked. She had been trained in law enforcement protocols during her military career. She knew procedure, and this was not it. But before she could speak, the cold, unyielding bite of handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. She had commanded thousands of soldiers in combat zones, faced life-and-death decisions under enemy fire, and now she was being treated like a common criminal on her own neighborhood street. No Miranda rights. No explanation. The younger officer glanced toward a small group of neighbors, peeking from behind curtains and front porches. She could feel their eyes on her. Their whispers carried on the wind. "Isn't that?" someone murmured. "Yes, that's General Carter," another voice replied in shock. Vanessa stood there, cuffed and humiliated, as the officers rifled through her vehicle. "What exactly are you looking for?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. "Ma'am, stay quiet," the tall officer snapped. She clenched her jaw. "No, I have a right to know why I'm being detained." The taller officer smirked, as if daring her to argue. "Like I said, suspicious vehicle. You fit the profile." "And what profile is that?" she pressed. He didn't answer. At that moment, Vanessa knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about a vehicle. It wasn't about suspicion. It was about her. The color of her skin. The fact that she was alone. The fact that, to them, she didn't look like someone who belonged here. The realization burned, but Vanessa's training kicked in. She took deep breaths, kept her voice level, and silently noted every detail: badge numbers, patrol car ID, body camera positions. Because if there was one thing she knew, it was that injustice left unchecked would only grow. After nearly 20 minutes of searching and questioning without finding a single shred of evidence, the younger officer finally muttered, "You're free to go." No apology. No acknowledgement of the humiliation they'd caused. Vanessa turned to face them squarely, her voice steady but cold. "You have no idea who I am, but trust me, you will." With that, she got in her car, drove away, and made a single phone call, one that would change everything for those two officers. The officers didn't just search Vanessa's car, they ransacked it. Her leather handbag was dumped onto the pavement, scattering keys, lip balm, and neatly folded receipts. Grocery bags were torn open, vegetables rolling across the asphalt. Even the pie her elderly mother had baked that morning, carefully wrapped in foil, still warm, was tipped sideways, the buttery crust crumbling into pieces. Vanessa watched it all with a calm, unblinking stare. She'd faced hostile insurgents in foreign war zones. She could handle 2 overzealous police officers on a quiet American street. Years of military discipline had taught her that exploding in anger rarely won the war. Instead, she measured every breath, every word. Her voice, when it came, was low but commanding, the kind of tone that could silence a room of soldiers. "Officers," she said evenly, "I am a United States Army general. I'm sure there's been a mistake." For a split second they paused, but instead of reassessing the situation, the tall officer snorted and the younger one smirked. "Yeah, and I'm the president," the tall one mocked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The younger officer chuckled and kept pawing through her glove compartment as if searching for buried treasure. Across the street, more neighbors emerged. A couple on their morning jog slowed to a stop, their brows knitting as they took in the scene. Cell phones began to rise, recording from every angle. Still, the officers didn't back down. If anything, the growing audience seemed to harden their resolve. The tall officer suddenly grabbed Vanessa by the arm, spinning her toward the patrol car. The metal cuffs bit into her wrists as he shoved her forward. "Move," he barked. She didn't resist, not physically, but her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him glance away for the briefest moment. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" a bystander shouted from the sidewalk. The officer's reply was cold, almost rehearsed. "Doesn't matter. Nobody's above the law." Vanessa's jaw tightened. She had spent her entire adult life serving the law, defending the Constitution, ensuring justice overseas, and representing the very country these men claimed to protect. And yet here she was, being paraded like a criminal in front of her own community. She knew she could end this charade in seconds. All it would take was one phone call. But the cuffs were tight, her phone was still in her car, and she wasn't about to beg for access like she'd done something wrong. As the officers tried to push her into the back seat of the cruiser, one of the joggers stepped closer. "You should probably check who she is before you embarrass yourselves," he said, his phone still recording. The younger officer glared at him. "Step back, sir, or you'll be next." The jogger raised his eyebrows, but didn't move, just kept filming. Then, as if the universe itself had decided enough was enough, a ringtone cut through the tense morning air. It was coming from Vanessa's jacket pocket. The younger officer reached in to retrieve it, clearly intending to switch it off. But the moment the phone lit up, a name flashed on the screen in bold letters. Colonel David Harper, Pentagon. Vanessa's lips curved into the smallest, calmest smile. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Answer it." The officer hesitated. "Who's Harper?" "My colleague," Vanessa replied, her tone steady as stone. "He's expecting me to brief him in an hour. You might want to explain why I'm in your custody instead." The tall officer and the younger one exchanged a quick glance. The confidence they'd worn moments ago seemed to falter, just slightly. "You can put on speaker," Vanessa added. When a younger officer did, the deep, authoritative voice of Colonel Harper filled the air. "General Carter? Are you all right? You didn't check in. Where are you?" The word general hit the crowd like a shockwave. People gasped. A couple of phones dipped for a second, then shot right back up to keep filming. Vanessa didn't even look at the officers. "Colonel, I've been detained," she said, her voice carrying for everyone to hear, "by 2 local officers who claim my vehicle is suspicious." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Harper's tone sharpened into something colder than steel. "Put me on with the arresting officer. Now." The tall officer swallowed hard. Suddenly, he wasn't so sure about the situation. Vanessa knew the tide had turned, and she was about to make sure the world saw exactly what happened next. The cold metal chair scraped against the floor as Vanessa sat in the small, windowless interrogation room. The walls were painted a dull gray, the kind of color designed to make people feel trapped. A single buzzing fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting shadows across the table. She hadn't been charged. No paperwork had been presented. No Miranda rights had been read. Yet she had been sitting there for nearly an hour, hands-free now, but still under watch. Time dragged, the ticking of a wall clock marking every passing second. Vanessa didn't fidget. She didn't sigh. She simply sat with the posture of a soldier, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes forward, as if she were on a battlefield rather than in a police station. Finally, the door opened. An officer stepped in, not either of the two who had arrested her, but a third, with a smugness that oozed from every step. His smirk was the kind worn by someone who thought he had the upper hand. "You ready to tell us what you were really doing in that neighborhood?" he asked, leaning on the table. Vanessa looked him dead in the eye. Her voice was calm, unshaken. "I like my one phone call." The officer hesitated, clearly not expecting that. "One phone call, huh?" He tried to sound dismissive, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Reluctantly, he pulled a desk phone across the table and slid it toward her. Vanessa picked up the receiver, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't ask for a phone book or a number. She didn't need one. Years of military service had trained her to memorize critical contact numbers, and the one she was about to use was burned into her mind like a classified code. She dialed. The line didn't even ring twice before a deep, commanding voice answered. "Pentagon Operations, this is Colonel Harris." Vanessa's tone was level, almost casual. "Colonel, this is General Carter. Badge numbers 472 and 881 of the city police have me in custody without cause. Please advise." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that carried more weight than a dozen shouted words. Then, Harris's voice dropped into a tone that could make even battle-hardened soldiers stand straighter. "Ma'am, say no more." Vanessa gave the faintest nod, then handed the phone back to the officer without another word. The officer took it awkwardly. "A hello." But the line was already dead. He looked at her as if trying to read whether she was bluffing. Vanessa simply folded her hands on the table and waited. Minutes later, the station's main line rang. A desk sergeant in the outer office picked it up and immediately stood straighter. "Yes, sir. Yes, sir, right away." The phone slammed back into its cradle. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Another officer answered, looking increasingly nervous. And then it rang again, and again. The calls came rapid fire, each one carrying more urgency than the last. The voices on the other end weren't local journalists or curious citizens. These were high-level officials, each one higher than the last. By the fourth call, the atmosphere in the station had shifted. The casual chatter was gone. The officers who had been milling around were now whispering in corners, casting uneasy glances toward the interrogation room. And then the door burst open. The police chief himself strode in, his face pale and glistening with sweat. His tie was crooked, his hands fidgeting as he spoke in a rush. "General Carter, ma'am, this is a terrible misunderstanding. I assure you, the officers involved will be dealt with immediately." Vanessa didn't move. She didn't offer him an easy out. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone cool. "Yes, ma'am," the chief stammered. "They didn't know. I mean, they weren't aware that I'm a general," she interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Or that I'm a citizen with rights under the law." The chief swallowed hard. "Both, ma'am. Entirely unacceptable. Before he could finish, another phone rang in the distance, and this time, the voice on the other end wanted him directly. He stepped away for a moment, and when he returned, his expression had gone from anxious to downright panicked. "Ma'am," he said, "the Secretary of Defense is on the line. He'd like to speak with you personally." Vanessa stood, smoothing the front of her hoodie. "No need," she replied. "You can tell him I'll be in his office this afternoon. And you can also tell him I expect a full report on the disciplinary actions taken against officers 472 and 881. The chief nodded so quickly it was almost comical. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Long." Vanessa walked out of the station without looking back, the weight of every camera phone following her. And as the automatic doors slid open, she knew one thing for certain. Those two officers' careers had just ended before they even realized the battle had begun. The chief's office door slammed shut, the sound echoing across the station like a gavel. Through the wide glass window, Vanessa stood in the corridor, arms folded, watching the scene unfold inside. The two arresting officers, still in their vests, badges gleaming, were being marched into the office like schoolboys sent to the principal. At first, their faces still held that stubborn, defiant set she'd seen earlier. The tall one leaned back his chair as if he still had the upper hand. The younger one crossed his arms, his jaw tight. But then the chief started talking. Vanessa couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shift in their expressions. It began with a flicker of doubt, then surprise, then a creeping pallor that drained the color from their faces. And finally, fear. The Pentagon had moved faster than even she expected. Colonel Harris hadn't just made a few calls. He had triggered a chain reaction. The Department of Justice had been alerted, and a formal complaint was already moving through the system. Federal oversight was now in play. This wasn't just about a wrongful detainment anymore. It was about potential civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and misconduct that could end careers permanently. The officers' bravado was gone. They stared at the desk in front of them, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of the chief's words. Vanessa waited, unblinking. 10 minutes later, the chief emerged. He looked like a man who had just aged a decade in the span of a conversation. His tie loosened, his posture sagging, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead. General Carter. He forced a thin smile that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "I'm so sorry. This was a huge misunderstanding." Vanessa didn't move. Her voice was quiet, but every syllable landed like a hammer. A misunderstanding is forgetting someone's name, Chief. This was abuse of power. The chief swallowed hard. "You're right. And I assure you, the matter is being addressed at the highest levels." Without another word, he motioned to a desk sergeant, who hurried forward with a clipboard. Within seconds, Vanessa's release was official. The cuffs were removed, the sharp sting on her wrist fading but not forgotten. Her handbag, groceries, and other belongings were returned to her, albeit in disarray. The once perfect pie from her mother was now just a heap of crumbs in a foil tin. She didn't comment. She didn't need to. As she walked toward the station's exit, every step was deliberate. The officers and staff she passed avoided her gaze, the weight of shame settling over the room. But the real damage wasn't to Vanessa. It was to them. The story didn't stay contained within the station walls. By the time she reached her car, several videos of her arrest had already hit social media. Clips showed her calm composure as the officers mocked her, the bystanders shouting in protest, and the moment Colonel Harris's voice rang out over the speakerphone. The footage went viral. Within hours, major news networks had picked up the story. The headlines were relentless. Decorated U.S. Army general wrongfully detained by local police. Arrogant officers mock general. Face Pentagon backlash. Public outrage flooded the city's social media pages. Demands for accountability grew louder with every passing hour. Within a week, both arresting officers were suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation. The department issued a public statement, but it did little to quiet the storm. A month later, the verdict came. The younger officer, facing the prospect of termination and loss of pension, resigned before the hearing could conclude. The taller one, the one who had shoved her, mocked her, and refused to listen, was formally fired. The internal review concluded that their actions had not only violated multiple department policies, but had also brought irreparable harm to the credibility of the entire force. For Vanessa, it wasn't about revenge, it was about principle. She hadn't called the Pentagon to flex her rank. She had called because abuse of power left unchecked would happen again to someone else, someone without the resources or connections to fight back. As she stood in her driveway that evening, the sunset casting long golden shadows, she thought about her mother's pie, the neighbors who had watched in shock, and the young jogger who had dared to speak up. In the military, she'd learned that some battles aren't fought on distant battlefields. They're fought right here at home. And sometimes, the most powerful victory is simply standing your ground until the truth wins. A month later, the sting of that day had faded, but the lesson had only grown sharper. General Vanessa Carter stood backstage at the Veterans Leadership Conference, the steady hum of a packed auditorium filling her ears. The nation's most decorated service members, military leaders, and young veterans were gathered to hear her speak. She wore her full dress uniform, deep navy blue, adorned with rows of gleaming medals and ribbons, each one a story in itself. Her polished shoes reflected the stage lights, and the gold trim on her jacket caught every flash from the waiting photographers. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. Vanessa took a breath, steady and sure, before beginning. Some of you know me as a soldier. Some of you know me as a general. But a month ago, on an ordinary Saturday morning, I was treated as neither. To two police officers, I was just suspicious. She let the words hang in the air, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. They didn't know my name, my history, my service, or my sacrifice. All they saw was a black woman in jeans and a hoodie. And that, in their eyes, was reason enough to treat me like a criminal. A ripple of unease moved through the audience. Vanessa's voice didn't waver. I wore the uniform of this country for over 25 years. I served overseas, commanded soldiers in combat, and stood ready to defend the rights of every American, including theirs. But on that street corner, none of that mattered. She paused, her medals catching the light as she leaned slightly closer to the microphone. Respect should never depend on the color of someone's skin or the clothes they wear. It should be the default, not the reward. The audience was quiet now, listening as if every word was a lifeline. I didn't tell this story today to humiliate those officers. I told it because this is bigger than me. My rank may have gotten me justice, but what about the people who don't have those connections? The young man stopped for walking home from work. The woman pulled over for a broken taillight. The teenager questioned for sitting in a park. She scanned the crowd, rows of hardened veterans, active duty officers, and community leaders. This isn't just a police problem, she said. It's a respect problem. It's a humanity problem. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. And here's the truth, Vanessa continued. The day I was arrested, I had a choice. I could walk away and forget it happened. But silence protects no one. I decided to speak because change doesn't happen when we stay quiet. Change happens when we hold people accountable, when we demand better. She straightened, her posture commanding yet calm. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. But I am determined. And I want every person here to leave this room with one promise. That you will see people, really see them, before you judge them. That you will use your voice, your position, and your influence to make sure no one is treated as less than human. Her final words carried the weight of her service, her resilience, and her unshakable belief in justice. I wore this uniform to defend rights for everyone, and I will keep defending them, in and out of uniform, for as long as I live. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, like a wave breaking, applause erupted. It started with a few claps, then grew into a standing ovation. Dozens of veterans rose to their feet, their own medals catching the light as they saluted. Vanessa's image, proud, strong, and unflinching, was captured by every camera in the room. By the end of the day, her speech was trending across social media. Clips were shared with hashtags like #StandWithVanessa and #JusticeForAll. Comment sections filled with messages of support. Some shared their own experiences with racial profiling. Others thanked her for giving them the courage to speak up. Vanessa Carter hadn't just walked away from that arrest. She had transformed it. What began as an act of humiliation became a rallying point for reform. Her story sparked local policy reviews, inspired police training changes in multiple states, and lit a fire in communities determined to push for accountability. And through it all, Vanessa kept repeating the same message in interviews and speeches. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve your country. Sometimes, serving your country means standing up for what's right, for who's right, and for the truth. She knew the fight against injustice wasn't over. But as she stepped down from that stage, the roar of applause still echoing in her ears, she was certain of one thing. She had just won one more battle, one lesson at a time. Thanks for watching. If this story inspired you, make sure to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real-life stories that will shock, inspire, and move you. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never stop standing up for what's right.